Frank Matthews was one of the most prominent African-American drug dealers of the mid-20th century. He managed to build a well-oiled drug trafficking system, covering dozens of cities and bringing in millions of dollars, and then, when things got hot, disappeared so that no one has been able to find him since. How he managed to do it, and whether he was able to lay low alive with the riches he earned, will be discussed in today's video. Meet Frank Matthews on the other side of the law. Before you continue watching, I'd like to ask for your financial support of the channel. At the link in the description, you can find my store-branded merch with exclusive prints designed by me. If you have the opportunity and you like something, please buy it, so you can help the channel to develop. Thank you in advance, and enjoy your viewing! Frank Matthews was born February 13, 1944. It's not known who his parents were, as he was eventually raised by his aunt. From the information that's been gathered, Frank's father and mother could have been Arthur and Hazel McNeil Matthews, both unnoteworthy people. Some individuals have noted that there's also a high possibility that the aunt, Marcella Steele Webb, could have been Frank's mother. There is, however, no documentary evidence to support this. Along with Matthews, Auntie also raised two of her own children, but there were never any bad feelings towards Frank. He and Marcella were on good, warm, familial terms to the end. The family lived in North Carolina in a small town called Durham. It would have been unremarkable if not for its unique position in the United States at the time. Thanks to tobacco, the town's economy was booming, but it was growing with a peculiar social overtone not typical of the time. After the abolition of slavery, both white and black entrepreneurs developed a parallel in the city, and the enterprises employed workers of all races equally. And by the middle of the 20th century, there were quite friendly relations between blacks and whites. Moreover, Durham saw a huge number of black millionaires. Ordinary black people also made decent money, compared to other cities. But despite this, Durham also had poor neighborhoods. Frank grew up in one of those. Yes, he had more than one example of black success in front of his eyes, which influenced his upbringing, but it didn't help to protect him from the criminal world. As a child, nothing foreshadowed that his fate would go down a slippery slope. Everyone who knew him in elementary and middle school noted that he was selfless and very generous. In high school, however, things began to change. At this time, many characterized Frank as charismatic and violent. Frank often got into fights. However, it is worth noting that it was not as if he liked to fight. Rather, Frank simply knew how to stand up for himself. And without violence in his circles, this was virtually impossible. It was around this time that Matthews' criminal path began. As later told by his childhood friend, they often jumped on the train with his crew, rode to the farmers' exchange, and stole chickens there, selling them afterward. According to recollections of the locals, a quarter was given for one chicken in those days, and after one such raid, the company could afford to eat hot dogs and go to the movies. What more could a poor teenager want back in those days? That same year, Frank first got into the crosshairs of the police. He was charged with battery and was released solely under the custody of his aunt. But that didn't stop him. Just a couple years later, he was back in the dock, now for stealing chickens. This time, he was transferred to a reform school, where he finished his studies. The only thing that saved him from jail was the fact that he was a minor. It's important to note that despite his close association with crime at that age, Frank was never involved in serious robbery. He stole a lot of petty stuff, but physical violence to get money or other valuables was unacceptable to him. Separately, we would like to specify that Frank studied in quite prestigious schools for his social status. Many teachers noted the high indicators of his intelligence. However, he did not like to study. As teachers later described Frank, he was a street kid and didn't take his studies seriously. Toward the end of his school life, Frank tried to start earning an honest living. He got a job at a barber shop where he learned a new trade, but he wouldn't work for long. He was caught stealing equipment and was fired. Eventually, Frank concluded that Durham was too small for him and decided to leave to seek a better life elsewhere. Where exactly Frank headed is not known for certain, and there are several theories. The first is that Matthews followed his mother. It's documented that in 1963, Frank had a half-sister. For reasons unknown, his mother moved to Philadelphia afterward. It was around this time that Matthews headed there as well. However, another version is accepted as the truth. Frank had a friend from childhood, Thomas Farrington. This ambitious and charismatic young man was tied to crime since his youth. What distinguished them was their attitude towards violence. Thomas didn't shy away from robberies, break-ins, and later even rape. However, he left Durham first, moving to Philadelphia. There, Thomas got in touch with the Black Mafia of Philadelphia, where he began to earn his authority. Frank, who followed his old friend, at first earned a living working in a barber shop. Afterwards, thanks to Thomas, he became a runner in the illegal lottery, taking bets from the locals. The point of this lottery was as follows. A certain set of numbers was chosen, for example, from 1 to 100. A man would place a bet by choosing one of those numbers. If he guessed correctly, then from a conditional bet of $1, he received $100. The result was determined by the outcome of races at the racetrack or trading on the stock exchange, something that anyone could look up in any newspaper. It was the job of the runners to recognize these numbers and accept the money, then run to the banker who controlled the lottery, giving the money and reporting the bets. For about a year, Frank went through life literally being an errand boy. In 1964, however, Matthews was once again in the crosshairs of the law. There's no specific reason for the accusation, but thanks to his acquaintances, Frank managed to escape justice. However, in return, he had to leave Philadelphia. This time, he was headed to New York. It was also not surprising. In those days, many such adventurers went to New York. And how was the Big Apple in those years? It was a time when the Italian mafia flourished, its ubiquitous presence in all areas of the city, including the drug trade, where almost all heroin dealers had to work with wholesalers from Costa Nostra. However, this was also the time when the first signs began to show that the Italians' monopoly would not last forever, as there were too many who did not support it. And the mid-60s also marked the era of civil rights reforms. At the legal level, racial segregation was eliminated, but in practice, it did not have a strong effect. No matter how much the law was changed, it was simply impossible to change the established traditions in society in a couple of years. It was hitting African American sentiment hard. More and more people became more radicalized towards the authorities and whites. The criminal world was also affected. Although the Italian mafia in New York mostly controlled illegal business in black neighborhoods, as you can learn more about in the video about Bumpy Johnson on my channel. In the 60s, people began to appear who, having made a lot of money, wanted to break away from the monopoly of the Italians. Before they could do it, it would take many years, but even then, such gangsters were literally heroes among their own. This is due to the fact that everyone saw it as a challenge to the system. Drug traffickers, in their eyes, went against the authorities, who, despite all the words, persuasion, and adoption of laws, could not fix the relationship between whites and blacks, and only fed promises. This was the situation in New York City when Frank Matthews arrived. The drug trade was seen by many locals as a way out of poverty, and Frank decided it was a great idea. At first, Frank also took a job at a barber shop and a part-time job as a runner. However, with the experience he already had and his ambition, he wasn't going to stop there for long. Working as a runner, he was able to meet Spanish Raymond Marquez. Toward the end of the 60s, Marquez was a major illegal lottery operator in New York, having been in the field since 1947. He had been in the crosshairs of authorities and served time in prison, but never made a deal with the government. That's why he was respected in the underworld. It was Raymond who introduced Frank to his Cuban friend, who delivered him his first shipment of heroin from Venezuela. Moreover, thanks to the acquaintance, Matthews was able to gain connections among the Corsican gangs. The Corsicans were one of the world's main suppliers of heroin in the mid-20th century. In general, they were not a single gang, but rather a hodgepodge of members who were involved in drug trafficking and smuggling almost all over the world. Of particular interest to the US government were the groups that collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. The CIA used them for its own purposes, including safe surveillance of communist Cuba from Venezuela. However, this was unknown to young Frank, and of little interest. Thanks to a Corsican agent, he was eventually able to smuggle a shipment of heroin into the United States through Venezuela on his own. They forged his documents, solved all logistical issues, and even took care of his stay. In fact, such an operation for a black guy was unique in those days. Few people in the States worked with the Corsicans bypassing the mafia, simply because there were no contracts, so Matthews was very lucky. So he managed to remove a whole link, which made the work noticeably easier and increased income. However, the supply from his Corsicans was quite unstable, and in order to scale up, Frank still had to reach out to heroin wholesalers from the mafia. They also approved him a rather large loan over time, which allowed Frank's organization to break into the big leagues. Yes, it was exactly an organization, because Frank was able to surround himself with loyal people experienced in their competences. This applied to all aspects: accounting, logistics, distribution, and so on. Another distinctive feature is that he did not strongly favor violent methods of solving problems. Of course, there were serious battles for territory in the early 70s, but they should be assessed more as a forced necessity. However, this does not mean that Frank was not respected and feared. He managed to find people who could kill at his word. Another peculiarity is that Frank kept an eye on the quality of his goods. The price and complexity of delivery never embarrassed him. With this, he became favorably distinguished from direct competitors, who were not shy to send a poor quality of goods and deliberate spoilage to save pennies and increase their quantity. Matthews was lucky in his personal life too. His wife, Barbara Hinton, according to contemporaries, was beautiful and sincerely loved Frank. However, in addition, she was a good accountant, which allowed her to competently conduct the financial policy of the gang. Gradually, his drug empire was able to achieve such success that he became a supplier in every major city on the East Coast. He had entire factories where workers were brought in by buses, where for about $100 a day, they packaged drugs. Matthews' product at the peak of his organization is believed to have been shipped to 21 states. Of the most notable gangs which Matthews worked with, in addition to the previously said Corsicans and the Italian Mafia, there was also the Philadelphia Black Mafia, who we have a separate video about on our channel. However, their cooperation was not pleasant for Frank. According to his memories, the Black Mafia never shied away from brutality. Moreover, some of his friends and partners were on bad terms with gangsters, which in the future resulted in an unpleasant story. As it goes, in Philadelphia, Matthews was supposed to meet with the previously mentioned Tommy Farrington in a nightclub with the Black Mafia and discuss some disagreements that arose over payments for working on their turf. But at the last minute, Frank was unable to attend. At the nightclub, however, small talk quickly devolved into a shootout in which Farrington was killed. Despite this blatant insolence, Frank did not start a war. He was well aware that he would not be able to overpower the ever-increasing Black Mafia, so he simply moved his other associates out of Philly. Surprisingly, when Frank was already at the height of his success, the government knew nothing about him, and for a long time the situation would have remained the same if not for a trivial accident. Starting in May 1968, Matthews, his lawful wife, and 3 children moved to a quiet middle-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. And by coincidence, his neighbor turned out to be a police officer. His name was Joe Kowalski. Being one of those attentive workers, he quickly noticed an interesting oddity. It was obvious from Frank that he always had money, but Joe noted that he had no regular, full-fledged job. Kowalski didn't like this very much and set up surveillance on his suspicious neighbor. At this time, more and more coworkers began to flock to Matthews to discuss work issues. Kowalski noticed all this, wrote down the license plates of the cars that drove up, and linked them to people. At one point, it paid off. One of Frank's visitors turned out to be a drug dealer and was on the watch list for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Also, in February 1971, he was able to catch Matthews engaged in suspicious activity outside his garage. Upon searching the place, he was able to find a small quantity of narcotics. He then prepared a detailed report and submitted it to his superiors. They appreciated his work, but because of the importance of the case, the information was transferred to the New York Joint Drug Task Force. Frank was assigned to Team 12, a subgroup within the task force. It was headed by Gerard Miller, an operative with 20 years of experience. His task was to gather enough evidence that Frank was involved in drug trafficking and transportation. It's worth referring to the situation in the US at the time. As previously indicated, drug addiction was actively spreading across the country and was acquiring catastrophic proportions. Therefore, an active fight against this scourge began. It's only that at that moment, there was not much money provided for it. This greatly affected the work of law enforcement agencies. If we refer to the before-mentioned Team 12, the operatives had to work overtime, and these hours were not paid. Cars were refueled at their own expense, and there was a catastrophic shortage of personnel. Even the apartment for monitoring Frank had to be rented at the personal expense of employees. At the same time, the necessary rights were not yet allocated to the operatives. They had the hardest job, to achieve significant results in an investigation in 3 months, without resorting to arrests and without direct interference in transactions, even if the operatives observed them with their own eyes. Gradually, however, success would come. In May 1971, for example, they were given the go-ahead to tap Matthews' phone. This provided some leads, but it quickly became clear that Frank knew he was being tapped. Over time, Team 12 investigators were able to reach an employee of Piedmont Airlines who claimed that flight attendants for that airline were being used to transport drugs for Matthews. The information also said that the drugs were supplied by Lakewood Foods, Inc., which provided catering services for Piedmont, Allegheny, and United Airlines. Eventually, Team 12 was able to discover that Matthews hired several flight attendants and paid them $1,000 a month for each shipment of heroin they transported. The flight attendant would pick up the packages at the airport locker, pack them in her flight bag, and leave them in another airport locker upon arrival. However, that wasn't enough. Law enforcers did not consider Frank a serious drug trafficker, estimating his turnover at 50 kilograms of heroin per month. Team 12 operatives continued to dig under Matthews. Frank, however, knew he was being watched. His evasive behavior and taunting of the operatives made it clear. This was not surprising for the time. Corruption in law enforcement was at an all-time high. According to the memories of many drug lords of the time, all the big players had several policemen on their payroll. However, against all odds, Team 12 continued to dig. During one of their stakeouts of Frank's new Cadillac, they followed him to one inconspicuous building. After a short amount of time, busloads of people began to stream in. There was no way to look into the windows. They were tightly boarded up with plywood. However, the building was 100% interesting for the members of Team 12. The first thing the specialist did was to check who owned the building, and there was no surprise there. It was one of Matthews' companies, OK Corral. However, there was still the question of how to break into the building. That's how a private painting campaign was born, the J&R Paint Company. The newly made painters arrived at the building and began to restore it with all responsibility. During the day, Team 12 employees managed to check all the windows, but this did not bring any results. However, they did manage to paint some of the building. As stated earlier, Frank did not like violence. However, in his line of business, he simply could not do without. This still did not add to Matthews' desire to get his hands dirty. Therefore, he began to search for a suitable candidate. In 1964, attending an underground fight, Frank met with Scarvy McCargo. This man's story was not some extravagant tale. He grew up in one of the ghettos of New York. There, he was able to achieve fame due to his violent temper and good physical shape. At the fight where Frank was, Scarvy was able to defeat his opponent with such ease that it impressed Matthews. The latter offered him a job to deal with debtors. The job was done flawlessly by McCargo, which secured him a place next to Frank. Gradually, Scarvy became responsible for almost all force operations in the gang, and gained fame as one of the most brutal and calculating gangsters of the time. In addition, he controlled heroin smuggling. Frank's business continued to grow at a tremendous rate, and he began to expand beyond New York City. It was around this time that William Beckwith came alongside Frank. Beckwith was a hereditary trucker. From a young age, he began to work with his father, thanks to which he gained experience in transportation logistics and navigation. Therefore, having returned from the Army, William's choice of profession was no mystery. But it quickly became clear that quiet and peaceful work was not for him. He wanted both more money and more interesting tasks. Since the crime of the time always needed carriers, joining the criminal world was not so difficult. William quickly earned a reputation as a man who could quickly deliver anything, anywhere. In doing so, he made his routes so that police simply could not catch him. After one such transportation of weapons from Chicago to New York, his customer put him in touch with Frank, who also needed the services of a carrier. Gradually, Beckwith became responsible for all of Matthews' transportation. It's worth noting here that there was nothing strange about the previous men in Frank's entourage. In fact, they were all lower-class people who, one way or another, wanted to find their place in the sun. To see a reasonably good accountant from an already middle-class background was more unexpected. Barbara Hinton was the accountant in the gang. She had a college degree from one of the best economics universities in the country. Her portfolio also included a job at a major financial firm. There, she was able to show her extraordinary intelligence and accounting acumen, and wait pretty for a promotion. If not for one thing, she was a woman. You see, the thing is that America in the late 60s and early 70s was a fairly conservative society, where gender discrimination was the norm. So Hinton started looking for other ways to make money. That's how she came out to Frank, who fell in love with the young and beautiful Hinton. And so in addition to a steady job, Barbara was able to find herself a husband. She developed a method that helped her launder several $1,000,000 through real estate investments. After that, she managed to get a foothold in the accountant position for the gang. Around Frank, though, it was more common to see his side girl. That was Thelma Darby, and she was in charge of intelligence. Thelma, from an early age, realized that she was pretty and quite charismatic, and that this could be used to her advantage. Therefore, she chose to work in elite clubs, where she made acquaintances with influential figures, and not only in the criminal world, but also with representatives of law enforcement agencies. It's not entirely clear why Thelma decided to help Frank initially. Perhaps it was his reputation as a generous man, perhaps his personal scent of cologne. However, the fact is that Thelma was the first to help Matthews, and then he offered her a job as an informant. But getting information is half the job. Using it wisely is a task not everyone can accomplish. That's why Frank's gang had James Carter, also a member of high society. Being the son of an official from Colombia and having received a higher education, he represented the interests of politicians and businessmen in court. This allowed him to acquire a lot of connections. However, none of them could offer him a permanent job. This was unlike Frank, who initially hired him to defend an employee, and later offered him to work on a permanent basis. However, despite his law degree, James was not a full-time lawyer. He was more engaged in lobbying and pre-trial case closures, negotiating with the higher-ups. That's when Thelma's expertise came in handy. Staff attorney in the gang was considered to be Charles Cameron. He graduated from Harvard and, like James, became a lawyer for politicians, officials, and big business people. According to some recollections, working for big businesses quickly frustrated him. The system in which the rule of money defeats the rule of law simply bored Charles. Working for Frank, on the other hand, allowed him to be fully exposed in his work. According to other recollections, Matthews simply paid more. Of course, this list of cronies is far from complete, but we'll stop here because these were the people convicted with Frank. Also, it's necessary to note two of Frank's deputies. The first is John Darby, nicknamed the Pope. He was born in the early 1930s in Brooklyn. He began his career in petty racketeering and gambling while still in his teens. In the 1950s, Darby became part of a major street gang. Then he came to Frank's attention in the early 1960s. When Pope became part of Matthews's gang, he mainly worked with the lower-ranking members, making sure they worked well together and maintaining discipline. In all of his tasks, Darby was known for his covert and non-aggressive approach. He used psychological pressure rather than violence to get his desired result. However, when the situation called for tough measures, Darby knew how to act decisively and without hesitation. His modus operandi was to minimize risk to the organization, keeping the operations clean and avoiding unnecessary attention from the law. The second important person is Mickey Beckwith. He was born in the 1940s to a poor family. His father worked as a dock worker and his mother was a housewife. The family lived in one of the most disadvantaged areas in the city, which from an early age immersed Beckwith in the world of street fighting and criminal machinations. Even then, he became known for his temper and willingness to use violence to solve any problem. At school, Mickey quickly earned a reputation as a brawler who did not tolerate ridicule and insults. At the same time, he had a natural charisma, which allowed him to easily gather like-minded people around him. Beckwith began his criminal career with petty racketeering, but quickly rose up, joining a local gang, where he became known as a ruthless and effective problem solver. Mickey Beckwith met Frank in New York through mutual acquaintances in the crime world. At that time, Matthews had already begun building his drug empire and was looking for reliable people to protect his business. Frank first turned to Mickey when he needed to deal with a rival gang that threatened to disrupt the drug supply. Beckwith not only successfully solved the problem by eliminating the leaders of that gang, but also showed himself as a man who could work quickly and effectively under stress. This impressed Matthews, and he offered Mickey a permanent position in his organization. Unlike Scarvy McCargo, Beckwith was more involved in security and organizing trade on the streets. By breaking down the major figures surrounding Frank, it is possible to understand more accurately how the system itself worked. Heroin entered the U.S. through a variety of channels. Scarvy McCargo was responsible for connections with suppliers from Southeast Asia, as well as Latin America. McCargo used couriers, containers, and diplomatic pouches to conceal shipments. To maintain control over the flow of drugs, Matthews did not rely on one single group, but he created interchangeable networks. His organization could quickly adapt and change supply routes if there was a threat of shipment being detained or a channel being exposed. Heroin arriving in the United States was refined and prepackaged in hidden laboratories located in New York and New Jersey. Once the drugs were processed and ready for sale, they were passed through a complex network of distributors that spread throughout major U.S. cities such as New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Los Angeles. Mickey Beckwith, as one of Matthews' closest subordinates, was in charge of force control on the streets. Beckwith and his men provided security for distributors and eliminated competitors if necessary. Parallel to the drug business, Matthews' empire engaged in extensive financial fraud. John Darby, who was Frank's confidant, controlled the cash flow and ensured its safe laundering. He used businesses such as car dealerships, nightclubs, and restaurants to legitimize profits. Barbara Hinton also played a role in money laundering by helping to integrate illegal profits into the legal economy through various means. Security was a priority for Matthews. His organization used everything from embedding informants in law enforcement to sophisticated information security systems. Mickey Beckwith and his team were responsible for forcefully protecting the business. They eliminated threats, whether it was a competitor, an employee, or even a police officer, if they became a danger to the business. Everyone in the network had clear roles, which minimized risk. The cash that came from drug sales quickly went underground, ensuring that the empire continued to expand. James W. Carter, the liaison between the various groups, also played a key role in coordinating supplies. This gave Matthews' empire the ability to control vast territories and maintain its position even in the face of constant threats from the police and rival drug syndicates. Back to Team 12. At every step, they were meeting resistance not only from Matthews' men, but also from their corrupt colleagues, but they were closing in on Frank. He was done in by his desire for a better life. At one point, Frank decided to move from his apartment in Brooklyn to a mansion that was located in the prestigious and wealthy Tote Hill neighborhood of Staten Island. Information about the cost of Frank's new home and its renovations was the authorities' new lead. This cost amounted to $260,000, including all the labor. Moreover, the entire sum was handed over in cash. However, according to the official version, Frank was simply engaged in real estate, and the contractors did not ask unnecessary questions. But the operatives of Team 12 did. Then, through a combination of many factors, law enforcement was able to reach Frank's deputies. Team 12 obtained a search warrant for John Darby on September 15, 1972. The operation seized $145,480 in cash, a small amount of narcotics, some weapons, and various documents relating to drug deals and expenditures. That was enough to put John behind bars. At the time that Darby was being searched, the already mentioned OK Corral Company was searched, with very good results. Agents seized 2.5 million parchment envelopes stacked to the ceiling, drug-cutting supplies, 2 52-gallon mixing barrels containing half a pound of heroin, a piece of paper labeled Pope Smith (John Darby, $41,000), weapons including a machine gun and rifle set, and $148,480. As a bonus, the raid team found a notebook containing coded information about various drug deals. And then there was Beckwith, who was sentenced to 12 years in prison based on the totality of the evidence. However, it should be noted that neither he nor Darby took a deal with the investigation. Even without that, their success was incredible. Overnight, Team 12 quite literally tied Frank's hands. For them, this was not only the first major victory, but also the beginning of the end for Black Caesar's empire. Just a month later, on October 12th, one of the biggest smugglers who cooperated with Frank was arrested. 2 days later, one of Matthews' major logisticians was caught. Further arrests continued. Gradually, Matthews' associates found themselves on the dock. But there was still not enough evidence to convict Frank. Yes, the 12 had informants, but they weren't close to Frank. And Matthews himself was a maneuverer. There was no way to prove he was running the drug trade, so the authorities took a different angle. They decided to prove Frank had unaccounted for cash and convicted him of tax evasion. However, in addition to the US government, Matthews found another serious enemy in the form of the Corsican gang. The point is that the authorities were able to interrupt the supply of heroin from Venezuela. This was achieved by nailing one of Frank's main partners, who eventually gave up the whole scheme. It was impossible to get Matthews again, but the Corsicans thought that Frank was to blame for it all. And accordingly, all the losses, including those at the expense of people's lives, fine-tuned routes, and other things fell on him. And on December 20th, 1972, they finally managed to get a warrant for the arrest of Matthews. While the bureaucratic wires were going through, Frank left to spend the New Year's holiday in Las Vegas, and from there he planned to head to Los Angeles. Several suitcases of cash were taken with him. Team 12 alerted their counterparts in Las Vegas. It was noted that he needed to be kept under the radar and constantly under surveillance. However, soon enough, the decision was reversed. It was dangerous to delay. Information that an arrest warrant had already been issued could be passed on to Frank and he could disappear. At 11 a.m. on January 5, 1973, Matthews and his mistress, Cheryl Denise, were detained at McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas when they were about to board a plane to Los Angeles. A trial was held the same day, where he was charged with possession and intent to sell 18.6 kilos of cocaine between April and September 1972. All that remained was to keep him in custody until he could be transferred to New York. To that end, the highest bail in U.S. history was set at $5 million. Very soon, he found himself in New York. There, the case began to drag forward. Prosecutors brought more and more new charges, which increasingly confused the case and made it more difficult for the court. It was at this point that Matthews changed his lawyer to the famous Gino Gallina, who specialized in such complex cases. The lawyer himself was famous for being unencumbered by moral and ethical issues and defended many famous gangsters of the time. Moreover, it's rumored that he stole their money, due to which he had many influential and dangerous enemies. However, Gino knew his business. At the next court session, Frank's bail was reduced to $325,000. Having mortgaged his property and receiving the remaining $100,000 from colleagues, Matthews went free. Hardship came for the drug business at that time. The American government actively took on the problem, which could not be turned a blind eye to any longer. Many channels of heroin supply were cut. Clandestine factories were closed. Most of the leaders of the drug business were prosecuted and jailed for long sentences. Matthews, on top of all this, had additional problems with both the IRS and human resources. In addition to him, all of his cronies we've already mentioned were in the dock. At the same time, some of the people with whom Frank worked began to testify against Frank under pressure from the authorities and reveal the schemes of his operation. Moreover, the confrontation with the Philadelphia Black Mafia also intensified. Even before Frank's arrest, several of Matthews' partners were brutally murdered. After the arrest, the Black Mafia began their final squeeze to get Frank out of Philly. Seeing this, other black groups also began to openly challenge Matthews. The Black Panthers, Black Muslims, and other small organizations began openly fighting Frank's men in African American neighborhoods in an attempt to restore order to the streets. Frank was forced to respond. On top of all these issues, another court hearing was approaching, where new charges were to be filed in the case. Frank fought and held on. But every day it became clearer and clearer that it was impossible to conduct either business or war under such conditions. On July 2, 1973, a rather expected event occurred. Matthews failed to show up for his regular court hearing. The next day, he was put on the wanted list. It's not known how Frank fled the country or if he fled at all. Some say he took the French leave and left without notice. Others say he said goodbye to his closest friends, gave away some of his wealth, and went on the run. In general, it should be noted that all further information is almost entirely based on hearsay, speculation, and rumors. Frank's disappearance was abrupt and mysterious. Further, it was not entirely clear whether Frank left alone. So according to one of his associates, it was he who took Matthews to the plane, where his mistress, Brown, flew with him. Another account says Frank didn't go anywhere. One of the detectives of the New York Police Department provided a report that he noticed Matthews in his white Cadillac convertible, but could not catch up with him. The information from the detective was taken into consideration. An in-country search was launched. There was a bounty on his head, posters all over New York City. Information from vigilant citizens was mostly useless. So much so that when Frank Matthews was found in an apartment and over 100 police officers were dispatched to apprehend him, they did arrest a Frank Matthews, but he was over 80 years old. Later traces of Black Caesar appeared literally all over the country. One of the biggest was led in Durham. Team 12 operatives managed to find out that Matthews was at First Union National Bank right then. Arriving there and talking to the manager, he pointed out that the agents had just missed Frank. Jumping out into the street, the operatives only saw a distant Lincoln painfully similar in description to the car Matthews had. However, it was not 100% confirmed that it was Frank. In addition, the staff of Team 12 were haunted by paranoia. because according to intel, Matthews took with him at least $2 million. Therefore, the requirement at the arrest was 1. Not to take him to court, but to wait for operatives from New York in order to evade a corrupt outcome of events. In addition to the official authorities, many of his colleagues also wanted a word with Frank. Thus, while raising money to pay for bail, one large insurance company helped with the sum. And after Frank jumped bail, it suffered monetary losses. Subsequently, an unknown male repaid the debt in cash, even more than the amount owed. Every empire has a beginning and an end, a rise and a fall, and criminal ones are no exception. By disappearing, Frank left behind a system that was at war, which had law enforcement on its tail, and those logistics were falling apart literally before their eyes. And these weaknesses began to take advantage of everyone. The story of Charles Cameron is illustrative here. He was put in the dock with Frank, and after he managed to get bail, he was immediately kidnapped. For 3 days, Cameron was held captive in an apartment while his kidnappers threatened him with death and physically abused him. The kidnappers also called Cameron's wife, family, and friends and demanded a $25,000 ransom. Police learned of the incident fairly quickly and immediately began investigating. They almost managed to locate the apartment where Cameron was being held, but in the meantime, family and friends paid the ransom. But this torment didn't end there. Officers detained Cameron and took him in for questioning. From the interrogation itself, it was evident that the incident had severely damaged Cameron's morale. He bluntly admitted to being a drug dealer and simply asked to be released. However, in Cameron's case, he then repeated the fate of his boss, at one point escaping bail. In 1975, however, Cameron was murdered, presumably for debts to heroin suppliers. The decay doesn't end there, however. Frank was a very charismatic guy and was able to unite people under his leadership, who, if it were not for working together, they would not even sit at the same table. And they had more than a few issues with each other, too. The main conflict was between Frank's chief deputies. Almost immediately, John Darby and Mickey Beckwith, who were able to get out on bail and tighten their criminal cases, began to pull people to their sides. In 1974, though, a major war broke out over Black Caesar's legacy. Ironically, there was no winner in this war. Yes, Mickey was the first to die, having been shot in 1975 in one of the gunfights, but by that time there was almost nothing left of Frank's empire, and in addition, Darby was under investigation but miraculously avoided prison. The fate of Frank's other associates is difficult to call positive. William Beckwith was arrested in 1975 and sentenced to 20 years. Along with him, James Carter was arrested and imprisoned. The only difference is that he managed to get out on parole after 5 years. Scarvy McCargo tried to get involved with the confrontation between John and Mickey by forming his own gang, but was almost immediately killed. Thelma and David Bates, on the other hand, realized in time where things were going and were able to successfully flee the country. Frank's wife was also arrested and charged with drug possession and distribution. The evidence was based on tapped phone calls. However, thanks to the skillful work of her attorney, and more importantly, Barbara herself, who knew what to say and how to say it, she emerged a free woman after 18 months of trial. After that, she did everything she could to make sure that neither her nor her children's criminal records would ever touch them again. Since about the 80s, the trial has been lost, and her exact fate is not known. Despite the fact that Frank's empire broke apart, the Black Caesar himself could not be caught, and that didn't sit well with anyone. 4 months after Matthews' disappearance, the Drug Enforcement Administration created the Central Tactical Unit 2, CENTAC 2. Its goal was to find Frank and capture as many members of his former organization as possible. In no time at all, cooperation was established with help from Interpol. After that, Frank was already on an international wanted list. 2 operatives, Al Parrish and Glenn Chisholm, distinguished themselves in the search for Matthews. These guys embedded themselves in Frank's case and literally lived it. However, having checked all the available information, they were at first disappointed. Frank could literally be anywhere, from Africa to Philadelphia. The main problem was that CENTAC 2 had no good informants. When interviewing everyone that Matthews knew, people either knew nothing or simply didn't want to talk or divulge information. Parrish and Chisholm decided to come at it from a different angle. They started tapping into Frank's old phone records, but even then, they failed. Not only did Frank encrypt his conversations, but he rarely talked about business in general. Slowly, some leads emerged. The operatives went on a road trip. They visited not only different regions of the United States, but also abroad. And they even sometimes achieved results, only a little less than they would have liked. Thanks to the work of Chisholm and Parrish, several of Matthews' associates were arrested. Frank, on the other hand, seemed like a ghost. Whenever there was a lead that would have led to his capture, it turned out to be false. So Chisholm and Parrish waited for Matthews at Christmas in Durham, or tried to find him among spectators at a boxing match. But each time, they failed. Except Chisholm and Parrish weren't about to give up. They continued to question witnesses, grabbing for any clues, but in 1975, Syntac 2 was disbanded, and the case was transferred to the U.S. Marshals. Then the case began to fade and become a cold case. There were fewer and fewer leads, and there were no more enthusiasts like Chisholm and Parrish. To this day, the case remains open. The public has always loved such mysterious stories. Therefore, several major theories about what happened to Matthews have gradually taken hold. The first is the one held by acquaintances, friends, and some of Frank's colleagues, that he is alive, unharmed, and enjoying his hard-earned wealth. According to it, Frank initially prepared an escape plan, used secret accounts, possibly had plastic surgery, and headed somewhere abroad. Another proof for the supporters of this theory are reports that he was seen in the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, Africa, and so on. The second theory, however, is diametrically opposed. According to it, Frank is already dead. Here the main evidence is that at the time of Matthews' disappearance, he had a conflict with the Corsican cartels. And while that wasn't much of a problem in the US, their power was much stronger overseas. And the last major theory is that Matthews headed to Africa and joined the revolutionaries there. The main evidence is that he was reportedly seen in Libya next to Gaddafi. However, this theory does not stand up to scrutiny at all. He would definitely appear in the reports of the CIA, KGB, or other organizations. There are other, even more outlandish accounts, but we won't mention those. They were fueled by the fact that up to the 90s, with inviolable frequency, there were reports that he was seen in the Caribbean, Algeria, Texas, Bermuda, and many other places. How many of these reports were true? It's hard to say, but it has never been possible to recognize Frank Matthews as either dead or alive.